Thank you so much for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're super excited now to be joined by Samantha Blanchard. Born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Sam began her music career at the age of 12 when she recorded her first original songs in a tiny studio on the bayous just outside her hometown. And in the years since, she's written countless syncs for television, created her own recording studio, and built a following as one of LA's emerging young blues artists. Meanwhile, this year alone, she saw her song Glitch Mode, written for K-pop's group NCT Dreams, gain 1 million views in its first 24 minutes on YouTube, debut at #1 on iTunes in over 28 countries, and move more than 3 million physical album sales. Whew. Sam, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So you've obviously been in the music industry for a minute, more than 20 years. And there's a lot of talk about how it's not a meritocracy and how corrupt it is, you know, like the Hunter S. Thompson quote that we actually used to have up on the wall in the tech shop at a studio I worked at. Quote, "The music business is a cruel and shallow money trench, a long plastic hallway where thieves and pimps run free and good men die like dogs. There's also a negative side."
What an inspiring quote. Nothing gets you motivated to work in music like that one.
I know, nothing got me motivated to huff solder like that quote. But so something that isn't often discussed, unless it's, you know, in a tome by Hunter S. Thompson, is this grotesque capitalist side, not just how cookie cutter wins the day, but how folks are pushed and twisted to create for pennies on the dollar, and how artists are asked, unlike pretty much any profession, to not only be a brilliant creative, but also a brilliant business person. So starting off, can you touch on that, like, demand for duality?
Yeah, so that's a great thing to point out first and foremost. I think to some extent that's always been the case in recent music history, meaning like the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years. I think that's something that's been a part of every artist's journey. Like if you look at somebody like Madonna, for example, that's definitely come into play, but I feel like it's gotten so pronounced specifically over the last like 5 years or so, where it's at a level that's troubling, in my opinion. You can look, for example, at some of this stuff. Sorry, there's a helicopter flying over my house. You can look at some of the things that like certain artists have been posting on social media, for example, like Gavin DeGraw, Halsey, have very infamously made TikToks about how they're being pressured by their labels to essentially advertise themselves on social media. Just such an interesting thing to consider when, you know, allegedly labels have people in place to advertise their music already. Why are they being asked to do it? Especially when those people are getting a portion of their proceeds to do exactly that. So now more than ever, an artist is not only expected to be, like you said, a business person and an artist, but also a marketing person, a social media genius, you know, a viral content expert. There's this sort of like influencer content creator syndrome, if you will, that has infected creating music, especially for people who are new to it. And it's creepy. And I'm not saying that there isn't a plus side to stuff like social media and, you know, doing the whole grassroots kind of thing and advertising yourself. I'm not talking about that, but there's it almost feels like it feels like a sort of outsourcing. That just is it's creepy is the way I would put it.
And I'm curious too, because, well, I mean, you can correct me, but I feel like not many people in the music industry wear as many hats as you do, even with the demands placed on them by today's standards. I mean, you write music, you perform it, you produce it, you co-write with other people. And probably some things that I have not mentioned. And so I'm curious, like for you, did you feel like, okay, well, in order to approach this lifelong dream of being in music, I just have to do all of this? Did it come about naturally, or was it kind of that like push to be all of the things?
Um, I don't think I ever had a push to do all of the things per se. When I first started, I started over 20 years ago. I started when I was a kid, and the only thing I knew how to do was write my own songs and record them. And at that point in time, I imagined that that's how I would earn my living and I would be famous and all that like goofy stuff. Um, and I always was a writer. So that's something I always did. And I started with, like I said, recording the songs that I had written. Nobody was writing for me. There wasn't like some old dude in the room, feeding me songs. That was never the case. So, I had this vision that I would make money in music, but because I was young and just starting out, I didn't really have an understanding of how people made money in music. Um, and as I got older, I started to learn that, like you were saying, there's a lot of different avenues where you can actually earn a living in the music business. For a while, I thought that was just going to be engineering for me because I didn't seem to have the right commercial look to make money as an artist. Thankfully, a lot of that has changed. That is one plus side of the way things have changed lately, where I don't feel that the music business is as confining in terms of appearance. There's still 100% standards held against certain groups of people and whatnot, but there's a lot more openness to what an artist looks like and what size they are and what race they are. So that's a positive. But for me at that time, none of that had happened yet. So for me in the last 10 years, what's happened interestingly is I've kind of managed to separate my artistic self from how I made money in the music business. So there's the writer self and the blues artist self. And I guess I was fed up with the idea that I was going, first of all, you don't really make money as a blues artist. So there's issue number one. But in separating that from how I, monetized my talent, it allowed me to be a more authentic artist because I was no longer looking at that to be my main source of income. And I kind of had if you can't beat them, join them mentality on the writer side, because then that allowed me to write music that didn't feel like it's something I would do as an artist, write music that I would never sing publicly. And it ended up being fun for me because I can kind of explore all these other personalities that I have outside of my blues artist self, but it also allows me to kind of be somewhat of a filthy capitalist on the writer side and do everything from Samsung commercials to like Paramount Plus shows and things. So that was a very long-winded answer to your question.
Not at all.
But
You should hear some of the answers I get.
Okay. So I think the dream morphed over time, and how I realistically figured out how to make a living definitely morphed over time as well. The older I got and the more educated I got in the business.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of people have this kind of very very, very rigid perspective, like, oh, if I can't do it the way that I thought when I was singing into my hairbrush when I was 7, then I'm not doing it. And that's why LA's like a bus stop. You have so many people coming in, going out, coming in, going out. And I think part of that too is the idea that there's always more dues to be paid. Like, I remember, I can't tell you the amount of times that people are like, oh, well, you just have to pay your due. You're not done paying your dues. And I'm just reminded of that song I think it's on the Sugarman album, where he says they asked me to pay my dues and I realized I'd overpaid them, and I'm like, yes, thank you. I need a refund. And I feel like that's also part of it, is that people don't really perceive, and people listening to this might not have any, any experience in the music industry. And I think that this is one of the things that, to me, it, like, accentuates the absurdity of trying to survive in the music business, is that you're not getting paid, but you're always expected to be paying your dues.
Right.
And you're supposed to be doing things for free for the experience or the
Right.
exposure and things like that. And so can you talk a little bit about that too? Because it's like, this is a very cutthroat capitalist industry. And at the same time, they're expecting people to just, live in this like sort of ridiculous world where apparently you don't need money to survive.
Yeah, there's, oh my gosh, that brings up so many things. So yeah, 100%. Especially on the production side, for anyone who's like in the engineering, mixing and mastering world, people who work in studios, that is very much a thing. There's like this whole hazing mentality where, if you're not grinding in the studio for, 14 hours that day, you're lazy and you don't want it that bad. There's that whole thing. That so yeah, there's definitely like this idea that you're never like worthy of getting paid, that it's always, like you said, you're always paying your dues, you're always on the come up, that type of thing. The way I think it's translated now is kind of what we were talking about a second ago. It's translated to like Spotify numbers, for example. Like, if, for example, an independent artist who's trying to quote unquote make it, whatever that means today, I think, who knows. Um, the idea of paying your dues is that you're constantly creating content. You are constantly begging people to stream your music online so that you can get numbers that would impress an A&R enough to take a meeting or read an email from you. So that whole pay your dues mentality kind of manifests itself in different ways depending on what hat you're wearing or what seat you're in the business, but it's still there. And the other thing too about that is I feel that that's not something exclusive to the music business. There's a lot of stuff that just in general day-to-day life, in a lot of business in general, corporate world, the same themes, the same exploitation, the same BS is in the music business, but the difference is that we're not working for a chair company anymore. We're not making chairs, we're making literally like emotions. So everyone's overly sensitive, because you're experiencing a lot of the same BS you would at an office job, but you're not talking about if Jerry met his sales quota. You're talking about, did Jerry's raw emotion and talent, his heart that he pulled out of his chest for people to listen to perfect strangers on the internet, did that meet the Spotify quota? Like, so it's kind of psychotic when you think about it, right? But on the flip side, that's kind of the one thing that's helped me feel sane, is when I do encounter some of that craziness, I remind myself, I'm like, well, this isn't any different than what I did experience when I worked regular jobs. I just am invested emotionally in a way I was not at a regular job. So I guess that's the other side of the coin. But yeah, that pay your dues on the come up thing, it's like struggle is so romanticized. But I think, again, to kind of echo what I'm saying, I think struggle is romanticized with everything.
Yeah, that's true. There's still this sort of romanticization of poverty, because there's this assumption that if you pick yourself up by your bootstraps and
Right,
work hard enough, of course, anyone can attain the American dream,
right,
and those who don't are just lazy.
right, right.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people that have that mentality, especially in the music business, are the same people that have it in other walks of life. It's typically older, um, men in power who have, from their view, really earned it from what they have. And so they're projecting that onto the people below them. You see that in studios all the time. It's like, it's the same thing you encounter in life, but it's just to a psychotic degree in a creative industry.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because it's there's been a couple of essays, and I like the book The Gift talked about the awkward feeling of it involving capitalism and human emotion, because you're not selling a chair, you're selling an
Right.
emotion, and you're selling an
Right.
emotional experience. And how
Right.
bizarre is that then to, like, you know, it's like when I got injured, and the lawyer I reached out to was like, well, you're going to want to tack on some money for your pain and suffering. I'm like, I don't know what that's worth. What is my pain and suffering worth?
Right.
What a
Right.
bizarre thing to ask.
I know. Yeah.
And of course I lowballed them because, yeah, I don't know.
Well, yeah, we're women, so we never want to take up too much space or ask for too many things. That's kind of like in our nature.
That's when you don't want to have a high tolerance for pain, I guess. So I want to kind of shift gears here,
Sure.
because and very much stay in the music industry, but kind of dig into the past a little bit too,
Yes.
while talking about your present, because you have an EP coming out that is covers of Elvis.
Yes. Yes.
Folks might be aware that there's an Elvis movie out.
Yes.
And so I kind of want to dig into that and talk specifically, because this is something that Baz Luhrmann dives into in the film. And there's been a lot of people who have volleyed back and forth about whether he did a good job or not, but like the race aspect. And
Yeah.
so I kind of want to touch on that to begin with, because there's this argument that's happening now about the responsibility that white musicians have
Ooh.
to Black, and as the documentary Rumble pointed out, to indigenous artists as well. The responsibility that white musicians have, which basically, regardless of whatever kind of music, unless it's like European flute music, you owe it, because rock, hip hop, blues, country,
Yeah.
everything stems from Black and indigenous artists. So I want to hear your thoughts about the responsibility that white musicians have in terms of their music careers, and how you feel specifically with regards to putting out this Elvis EP, and how you feel about that and his legacy.
Oh my gosh, there's so much to answer. I could talk on this for hours. So first I'll say, it's this Elvis project is an interesting thing for me, because like I stated earlier, in recent years I've managed to separate my artistic career from how I made money. And a couple years ago I was signed to a publisher out of New York, called Rally Music Group. And interestingly, they own a sizable chunk of the Elvis catalog. And so it's been an ongoing discussion to have me do some Elvis covers so they can kind of have fresh recordings of, songs that they own or administer, whatever you want to call it. And I've always been interested in doing that, but I needed to do it the right way. I needed to do it in a way that felt like something I would do as an artist. And so oddly, it's kind of this moment where sort of my two worlds are fusing a little bit, where I'm doing something that is more my artist self, but it's also an attempt at like licensing, essentially, to get, those songs on shows like Euphoria, things like that. So it's me being a little bit of a dirty capitalist in some ways. But that being said, there's a lot to talk about, like you said, with responsibility. That is something that I consider heavily, and it's one of the reasons why there was this sort of split, if you will, between what I do as a writer and what I do as an artist. When I am my artist self and when I'm performing my blues stuff with a live band and everything, priority number one for me is to have people on stage with me that represent the music I'm playing. I get real uncomfortable when I go to a lot of blues gigs and it's like all white people. Not that they don't have a right to enjoy that music it's beautiful that they do, but there's again a creepiness, I like the word creepy, to a music that was started by Black people in the South that has sort of been hijacked by, 60-year-old, 70-year-old white dudes. There's something creepy to that. So, I already feel somewhat strange in doing the kind of music I do as an artist because that music didn't completely belong to me. I feel connected to it in some ways because I'm from Louisiana. There's a lot of blues history in Louisiana. So some of it I feel not ownership, because that's not the right word, but I feel connected to in that way. So I don't feel like it's entirely inauthentic to do that. But because there's definitely a disconnect, because I, as a white woman singing like Bessie Smith songs, um, I want to make sure I represent on stage, I want to have Black musicians in my band. That's important to me. I don't want a bunch of white dudes up there with me. So it's something I'm very, very sensitized to. And it's one of the reasons why my writer self did separate, because as a writer, I do work on a lot of like hip hop. I work on a lot of R&B music that doesn't belong to me in any way, shape, or form, and I don't want it to. So writing it and then passing it off to an artist who does, come from that background, who does have ownership in that music, that feels more ethical to me. And I think it's something that weirdly gets a pass in the music business. Like there's just certain artists who are so clearly appropriating Black and indigenous cultures and don't get called out for it at all. And it's not to say they're malicious in doing so, but they're so unaware of it that their following's not aware of it. And it's kind of weird. So I think white musicians have an absolute responsibility to know their music history and then make sure to in some way respect that. And I think that's part of the problem, is that so many people in the music business do not even know the history behind the music they're doing. So I think it always usually comes down to education. So people should know more about the worlds they're living in musically, and they don't. But I try to.
Absolutely. And I think something that you touched upon is kind of an interesting, if I may step into the nerdery for a moment.
Yeah, please.
Like just this concept of ownership of a type of music is also really creepy and capitalist. Like, why do you need to own the genre that you're performing?
Right.
Like, I never felt ownership of hard rock.
Mm-hmm.
Even before I knew that it, if you just go back a couple of generations and you see that it's certainly not owned by people or started by people who look like me.
Right.
But even then, I didn't feel the need to own it. I just felt lucky and glad, and of course frustrated that I didn't play at MSG, but whatever. I just felt lucky and glad to be on stage, like headbanging and doing this like incredibly like kinetic and raw, jagged art form. I think just the whole concept of ownership is very white.
Right. Yeah.
And like is very problematic, whether we're talking about, whether we're talking about the long history of ownership, or just the concept of owning like a creative art form, which just feels odd, even just saying that.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting point. And it's something that is very blues. So, we're not quite talking about this, but this could be applied to what we're discussing. There's a lot of weird stuff going on right now in music with lawsuits and copyrights and people getting sued for literally using common phrases in songs. We're starting to get to the point where we're giving publishing to people for using the same synth sound as another. Things are getting really strange in the music business, where there's this idea that like, oh no, I own that riff. And there's a lot of lawsuits coming down the pike because of it. And, it brings up that question of, at the end of the day, does it really belong to anyone? You know what I mean? And it's an interesting question because, and on the one hand, you don't want to say, well, you're essentially like ripping off this culture and you're claiming that you invented it, and that's awful. But on the other side, like you're talking about, there's this idea of like music belongs to everyone, no one owns it. And those two things can be at odds with one another. But I think there's always like a middle ground somewhere. But what I was coming to is that it's funny because in blues specifically, it was quite the opposite, especially like if you look at early blues, which is what I'm the most nerdy about, 20s, 30s, that era before the, what we know to be the commercial music business, like the very kind of beginning days of the business. Blues artists were ripping each other off left and right, but they didn't see it that way. It was the same 12 bar chords, the same top line melody, but different words plugged in. And that wasn't weird at all. They were like, oh, well, this is, this is her version of that, that Robert Johnson, where you wanna go, like that. There's so many different versions of that. So there was a very like sharing communal ness, for lack of better words, in the blues world early on that we have lost in the music business because we're so freaked out about who owns what. So it's an interesting question. Like I said, they're often kind of things, ideas that are at odds with one another, but there's points to be made on both sides for sure.
But also just feels very indicative of like, oh, there was like this rad thing happening and it was all mutualistic. And then
Right.
capitalism and whiteness comes in and be like, hey,
Right.
let me destroy that for you.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. For sure.
But yeah, and I think there's a lot of like threads to pull on that. And I do think, it's kind of like I would used to say to people, it's like, I wish that I could pay my landlord in tickets to my show, or like I wish that I could pay him in good deeds, or like, but I can't.
What
So
kind of deeds?
right. Therefore, I have to at some point be like, I have to get paid for this riff, or I have to get paid for this melody. And that's, it is what it is.
Yeah. And I mean, I say this as somebody who feels both ways about it too, because, I'm talking about all these lawsuits, and as a creative person, I find them to be ridiculous. Like nobody owns common phrases in language. Nobody owns using a particular synth sound. That's nuts. That's like saying if one person used a ukulele once that nobody else can. It's crazy. But I also get the reasoning behind it because, as a songwriter, I don't want somebody to rip my stuff off and then me not get compensated for it. So again, there's a very like two-sided argument. And I think it's about finding something in the middle, but it's really hard to do that. Everything in society is so polarized now.
Yeah. And as you said, when you're dealing with emotions, it's not like you're dealing with chairs. It's a lot more difficult.
Exactly. Correct. Exactly. It's not chairs.
So like just before we wrap up, I do want to get your take on this because I know that you're also a movie buff, and I want to get your take on this, and also just kind of the Elvis story in particular, since you have that EP coming out.
Yeah.
How do you feel that the movie treats Elvis, and how do you feel that Elvis did in terms of acknowledging where his livelihood came from?
Yeah. So speaking of two sides to a coin, I feel like there's a lot of legitimate criticism of Elvis, and the fact that he was singing at the time what was perceived as Black music, because that's definitely changed since then. And he did do that. I think whether he did it fully aware is kind of a different. I think whether he was aware of the fact that he was doing it is a completely different conversation, which doesn't make it any better. But what I appreciated is that the movie didn't shy away from discussing this. It didn't just gloss over that fact. Um, and it does point out, it's like, Elvis was doing the same music that his buddies were, like Muddy Waters, but he was getting the limelight for it, and he was getting all the accolades, and the movie like specifically points that out. I obviously I wasn't around in the time of Elvis. If I had to go with what I know about him, I feel like he saw himself as someone who was championing that kind of music and didn't see himself as a vulture or a culture vulture of that kind of music. So I think in some ways he gets a little bit of an unfair rap, but people are not wrong when they make those critiques in any way. For me, I wouldn't call myself a quote unquote Elvis fan. I respect his music, I respect his legacy. For me, what I'm a fan of is kind of the interesting place he sits in music history. And so, at that time, there was sort of this evolution of blues to rock. And Elvis is kind of the missing link in that evolution. Now, whether he's rightfully that missing link or not, that's another conversation. But it's in terms of just like what on paper has become the culture and become the story, he definitely was that. And on the flip side of that, there were people like Chuck Berry existing at the same time, who was a black guy doing quote unquote white music. So there's a lot of sort of like flip-flopping culturally that's happening in music at that time that is very interesting. And then who was getting the accolades for it and who wasn't is also an interesting conversation. But I respect, like I said, his position at that pivotal moment when blues sort of evolved into rock. And so that's what I'm a fan of, because he's so important to the blues story and how it became something else. For me as an artist, I tend to hover before that. I tend to kind of be in the era again of like the 20s, 30s, the Memphis Minnie, the Bessie Smith. That's my favorite era, before blues went electric, when it was more acoustic based. That's my jam, for lack of better terms. So when Elvis comes into the picture, and then BB King and stuff, I kind of drop off a little bit. But it was important for me to do this EP for a lot of different reasons that were personal too. My dad was a huge Elvis fan. My dad passed away in October, so it was kind of an homage to him. And to take Elvis stuff and make it bluesy, something about that felt like respecting the kind of musicians that he respected, and that he had, if you want to say, taken from. So to do it in that style, I feel like returns it back to its original form in some way. So yeah, it's a complicated question. I think Elvis is a complicated figure, far more complicated than people really think. And I think Baz Luhrmann did a fairly good job of addressing this in the movie. Could he probably have leaned in a little bit more? I think so. But he didn't shy away from it. I think the movie's really long, and I think he could have spent more time on it, but I think he probably didn't, only because the movie was already so long. Like I feel like it's more of an edit thing, not an intention thing. But I think he still touches on it very well and doesn't shy away. It's not a moment. It's kind of interwoven into a lot of the story, and in a way that I think is pretty respectful. I loved the movie, and Butler, why can't I not remember his first name? The kid who plays him is phenomenal, like just unbelievably good in it. For anybody who's a music fan, they should watch the movie, and then they should go stream the Elvis EP, which is not out yet. We're waiting on some copyright sign-offs. But it should be available for streaming pretty soon, and it's called All Shook Up, Sam Sings Elvis.
And well, at this point in the show, you all will have heard one of the songs. So I don't know how you could possibly not love it as much as I do. But I have a for those listening, I have a long running love affair with Sam's voice.
Oh
And
God.
when she dies, I hope she donates it to science.
That got dark real quick.
So that we can just keep it playing forever and ever until the sun swallows the earth.
Oh my God.
But yeah, I thank you so much for the insight and the nuance, I think, too, which is something that is rapidly being stamped out in our world.
Oh yeah. There ain't no room for nuance. No. No, what is that?
So thank you for that. And please let folks know where they could find out more about what you're doing.
Yeah, so interesting to kind of give out all my social media, being that I just talked about how weird it is that artists are promoting themselves on social media. But the best way to find me is on Instagram. I'm just at Sam Seasoned, SAMSZND. That is my writer persona. That is why that is the name. But on Spotify, when you want to check out the music, same thing. You can just look up that name, Sam SZND, Sam Seasoned. I'm a Cajun girl. I do spice mixes. That's why I'm called that. So we haven't quite figured out how to resolve my issue of being one name on one side of the business and my real name on the other. So for now, that'll work.
The artist formerly known as.
Yeah, exactly. As myself. An existential crisis.
I feel like every artist has at least one of those.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you for having me.